If I am being honest with you, there was a time in my life when I would quietly say to myself, I wish I had accepted Christ into my life much earlier, because hindsight has a way of revealing how much pain, confusion, and unnecessary detours we could have avoided if we had surrendered sooner rather than later. Have you ever noticed how many of us only begin to search for God after something has broken, after a relationship has collapsed, after money has failed us, after our health has shaken us, or after pride has led us into a corner where we can no longer pretend to be in control? It is almost as though we reserve God for emergencies, like a spiritual fire extinguisher that will break open when the flames have already surrounded us. And the uncomfortable question we must ask ourselves is this: why do we always seem to find God after we have fallen? Why is it that we resist Him in seasons of strength, yet reach for Him desperately in seasons of weakness? The answer is not complicated, even though it may be painful to admit, because we reach for God for the same reason a person reaches for a crutch when they can no longer walk steadily on their own. When everything is working, when business is booming, when influence is increasing, when the applause is loud and the bank account is healthy, we often convince ourselves that we are self-made, self-sustained, and self-sufficient. And in that illusion of independence, pride quietly takes root in our hearts. Pride is subtle because it does not always look like arrogance or loud boasting. Sometimes it simply looks like ignoring God while enjoying His blessings. The scripture in James chapter 4 verse 6 says, He gives more grace. And that phrase alone is powerful enough to carry you through any season of life, because it means that no matter how far you have fallen, no matter how stubborn you have been, no matter how long you delayed your surrender, there is still grace available. But the verse does not stop there, because it goes on to say that the Lord opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble. And that is where the real issue lies. God opposes the proud, not because He enjoys punishing people, but because pride blocks relationship. Pride resists correction. Pride refuses surrender. And pride insists on sitting on a throne that was never meant for human shoulders. When we are proud, we attempt to manage life without reference to God. And in doing so, we place ourselves in opposition to the very one who sustains our breath. It is often in falling that pride is shattered, because falling exposes our limitations in a way success never does. When you cannot walk steadily anymore, you suddenly understand the value of support. When your own strength fails, you suddenly appreciate the mercy of grace. When your plans collapse, you begin to see how fragile human control truly is. Many of us came to Christ not at the height of celebration, but in the valley of crisis. Not when everything was perfect, but when everything was painfully imperfect. And although we sometimes regret the delay, we must also recognize that even in our late arrival, grace was waiting patiently. The fact that we found God after falling does not mean He was absent before. It simply means we were not ready to humble ourselves enough to see Him. Humility is not weakness, And it is not self hatred. It is not pretending that you have no gifts or achievements. Humility is the honest recognition that everything you are and everything you have flows from a source greater than yourself. Humility says, I cannot carry this alone. And in that confession, heaven responds with more grace. The beautiful thing about grace is that it is not rationed according to how impressive you look. It is released according to how surrendered you are. The proud may appear strong on the outside, but internally they are isolated from divine assistance. While the humble may appear broken, yet they are surrounded by supernatural help. So, if you find yourself saying, I wish I had accepted Christ earlier, do not allow that regret to turn into shame, because shame paralyzes when grace restores. And remember that the very awareness you now have is evidence that grace is already at work within you. What matters most is not how late you arrive, but that you have finally chosen to kneel rather than stand in resistance. Perhaps the real transformation begins when we stop asking why we only found God after we fell, and instead ask, how can we remain humble even when we rise again? Because if falling teaches us dependence, then wisdom teaches us to keep that dependence even in seasons of strength. The goal is not to wait for another crisis before seeking God, but to cultivate a daily posture of humility that says, Lord, I need you. Whether life feels stable or shaky, and the promise remains unshaken, He gives more grace, not less grace for your past, not limited grace for your mistake, but more grace for every stage of your journey. If you are listening today and you recognize yourself in this story, understand that the crutch you reached for in weakness is not a symbol of failure, but a doorway into a relationship built on humility, dependence, and abundance grace. That is a foundation far stronger than pride could ever provide. If you have been blessed by this episode of Hope in Transit, I'd like you to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. God bless you.